Well, hey guys, I'm Nick and welcome back to Sci-Finatics. Well, today we're talking about Star Trek Strange New Worlds Season 2, Episode 8, entitled Under the Cloak of War. This was our slightly darker episode, this one. I guess because we had the levity of the Lower Decks crossover last week, and next week we've got the levity of the musical episode. Sandwiched in between these two very light and fluffy episodes is one pretty dark episode. This was the kind of war, what is it good for, I guess, kind of episode where we've got umpteen different officers from Mbenga to Chapel to Ortegas all going through these PTSD issues wrapped up in the Klingon War. We've got the Klingon ambassador coming on board the ship wanting to kind of smooth things a little bit between the Klingon Empire and the Federation, and these officers just not having a bar of it. There were some interesting bits about this episode, and there's some bits that kind of struck me as a little bit odd, and we're going to go through all that bits and pieces today in my review for this episode. So stick with me as we break down Under the Cloak of War, Episode 8 of Strange New World Season 2. The episode starts off with a very interesting looking Federation starship, I think it's called the Calcium A, which was dropping off Ambassador Ra to the Enterprise. We kind of haven't seen a Federation starship quite like this before. It was quite unique. Didn't have a saucer section. It was sort of a bit more of a triangular, pointy kind of hull. Not your typical saucer and two nacelles kind of configuration. We get all the pomp and ceremony of the bosun's whistle being blown as Ambassador Ra, the Klingon, comes on board the Enterprise. And despite some raised eyebrows, he asks for a tour of the Enterprise, like he's a bit of a tourist. And you can tell right from the get-go this episode that, there's a whole bunch of crew, particularly Ortegas, Chapel and Mbenga, who fought in the Klingon War, that aren't particularly comfortable by his presence being on board the Enterprise. We get some uncomfortable scenes in the bridge there as Ortegas kind of puts her foot in her mouth a little bit and has to stop speaking pretty quickly as Ambassador Ra comes on board the bridge and spouting all anti-Klingon stuff about the war and everything there. And then we have a scene in the recreation lounge with Spock making him a Raktajino, trying to get the mix just right. I didn't think they were using replicators back in this era of Starfleet, that the whole replicators didn't enter into things until around the time of Star Trek VI, Undiscovered Country. I think we might have seen replicators used there on board Federation starships, but not before. But I guess maybe they've, just for the ease of storytelling, maybe they've introduced them in this era just to make things a little bit simpler. Spock doesn't quite get the Raktajino quite right and ends up burning Ambassador Ra's hand. I think this is possibly one of the first mentions of Raktajino, the Klingon coffee, in the original kind of series time frame. I don't think Raktajinos were kind of introduced until Next Generation, or might have even been DS9. I remember they were mentioned because I think Deanna Troi didn't mind the Raktajino every once in a while. I think they were either introduced on DS9 or Next Generation, but certainly we haven't really, not that I can remember at least, had the establishment of Raktajinos in the original series kind of time frame before. Ra ends up in sickbay to treat his burnt hand, and here's when we see Mbenga doing a bit of a freak out. He's obviously got some pretty major PTSD. He's freaking out in sickbay, having to kind of excuse himself into another room while he has a heart palpitation on a bio bed there, overseeing Ambassador Ra. And now we kind of get the sense that there's, some pretty severe, PTSD on board the crew here, wrapped up in the Klingon War. We get a flashback to the Battle of Jigal during the Klingon War there, and we see Chapel greeted by this Starfleet officer by the name of Buck. Now, Buck is a bit of a Star Trek veteran. Clint Howard, the actor who plays Buck, has been in a lot of Star Trek before. Most notably, he played Balok in the Corbomite Maneuver as a child. He played a character called Grady in the DS9 episode Past Tense Part 2. He played a Ferengi called Muck in a Star Trek Enterprise episode Acquisition. And he was even in an episode of Star Trek Discovery as a creepy Orion guy. So he's been in Star Trek quite a bit, this actor. And he's appearing again in Strange New Worlds in the role of Buck. We get our first ever meeting between Chapel and Mbenga. Benga looks like he's going through some hard times here on Jigal. The war is taking its toll on him, clearly. We've got wounded soldiers coming in left, right and centre. We've got triage situations happening and trying to do surgery and patch people up without the necessary supplies. They end up even having to put an officer in the transport buffer to keep him alive because his injuries are so bad, which is kind of interesting, I thought, with this scene because it was kind of like the origins of what he had to do for his daughter Rukia when she was suffering from that illness. He had to put her in the transport buffer, and you're going to go, okay, he kind of learnt to do this back on the Klingon front with the wounded soldiers, and he's just kind of carried that technique on for his daughter when she was sick. We get Pike coming by to have a bit of a chat to Mbenga about his war history and everything under the guise of borrowing some Delton parsley. Delton's obviously being the bald race, most notably Elia in the motion picture. I did find it quite odd in this episode that Mbenga went to the trouble of explaining that Delton parsley was deadly in excessive amounts, and a piece of information like this, when normally introduced in a script, comes back later on in the story in some fashion. So I was thinking as I saw this scene that this parsley is going to be used to poison the Klingon or something later on in the episode, but it never came into play in any stage in the plot whatsoever, so it does seem odd that they introduced this without having it pay off in any way. And Mbenga and Chapel kind of begrudgingly agree to attend the dinner with Ambassador Ra. I kind of found this whole thing that Pike was doing in this episode to kind of essentially force his officers that have obviously severe PTSD from the war to participate in a Klingon dinner with Ambassador Ra. Surely, if you were the captain, you would excuse these officers. It seemed like a really bad move on Pike's behalf. I know the orders came from higher ups in Starfleet, and I kind of get the fact that they sort of wanted officers who'd served in the war to kind of put their history behind them and sort of suck it up and come to dinner. But it was not like they were like, this was on display to anybody outside the officers on board the ship. It's not like they were at a big banquet on Federation headquarters, at Starfleet headquarters on Earth. They were just in Pike's quarters, hanging out for dinner on way to dropping him off at a starbase. So it seemed really quite wrong, from my point of view, for Pike to kind of request that these officers that served on board his ship, that clearly were very damaged by their war experiences, to essentially have dinner with the worst Klingon that committed all these atrocities during the war. It's kind of akin to asking a bunch of Jewish people to sit down and have dinner with Hitler. It just seemed like a very bad strategy on Pike's behalf, and it kind of almost struck me as they're just doing this to create drama. It's completely unnecessary, and it seemed a little bit out of character for Pike. Would Pike really do this in a real life situation? Is this something he would do as a captain? And I honestly think he would have given these officers a pass and say, look, don't worry about it. I know you've been through a lot. You guys can sit it out. We don't need you at dinner. We'll have other officers that are quite happy to participate in the dinner. It struck me as a situation that wasn't necessarily true to his character, but something the writers of the show sort of foisted upon the plot in order to create drama, and not a truthful choice that Pike would make as a captain to force his officers to sit down to dinner with this guy. And looking at some of the flashback scenes, particularly between Mbenga and Chapel and everything, they went through a lot. There was a lot of war-torn flashbacks that we watched in this episode, illustrating exactly the circumstances they were under during the war, and it looks pretty harrowing. You can't blame them for feeling like they did in this episode. It obviously wasn't the best situation to live through. Back with our Jigal flashbacks, we see Mbenga talking to an Andorian and so forth, and now we kind of find out a bit more about the history of the super soldier serum we saw back in episode 1 of the season, with Chapel and Mbenga taking the Protocol 12 drug that fires you up and makes you stronger and makes it so you don't feel pain and all that sort of thing. So I guess that was sort of good to see the origins of that. But at the same time, I'm a little bit dubious about this whole Protocol 12 drug, that they've got this sort of essentially super soldier serum sitting around that they can use any time they like as this kind of get out of jail free card. Hopefully we don't see used too often, and it doesn't just become this, oh, let's just take the super soldier serum whenever we like, because this will get us out of a sticky situation. We get a sparring session between Ra and Mbenga where, all the aggression and all of the history and backstory and everything kind of comes out. So that was an interesting scene. They're really giving Babs a lot of work this season, utilising his martial arts skills. Feels like almost there hasn't been an episode with Mbenga in this season where he hasn't utilised his black belt in jiu-jitsu on screen in some capacity for the show. It just sort of feels like, oh, okay, Babs has got a black belt. Let's give him every martial arts scene this season, and I get doing it once or twice, but it kind of almost feels like every episode we've somehow managed to crowbar in Babs's proficiency in martial arts. It sort of do it once or twice, that's cool, but it sort of is starting to feel a little bit overused. Spock tries to calm down Chapel, but she kind of just wants to be left alone and deal with her PTSD by herself. So there's a little bit of tension there in this episode between Spock and Chapel. In the next little flashback, Mbenga utilises the whole needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one proposition by deleting an injured crewman's pattern from the transporter buffer in order to beam a whole lot of other injured people back on board the little triage medical camp there on Jigal. Mbenga essentially took the super soldier serum, the Protocol 12 drug, to help save a lot of lives. It would appear that all of this big nasty reputation that Ambassador Ra has about being the butcher of Jigal and how he killed all of his men and, in order to escape and is all a bunch of BS. And it was actually Mbenga, with the super soldier serum that killed all the Klingons on Jigal, and essentially Ambassador Ra was a bit of a coward and he fled whilst Mbenga killed all of his men, and then he took credit for killing all of his men. How does this do him any favours? It's like, okay, he fled and Mbenga killed all of his men, but rather than saying, oh, I was defeated by the Federation, and I ran like a coward, it's like, I killed all of my own men. I'm not sure how this change of the narrative does him any huge favours amongst the Klingon Empire. I think it was a really nice twist. I was surprised by the twist. I think, that was a cool twist. The fact that Mbenga was in fact the butcher of Jigal, and he utilised his super soldier serum to kill a whole bunch of Klingons. Ambassador Ra took credit for it, but the motivations behind taking credit for it and everything just seemed a little bit off to me. There's a few little elements of logic in this course of action that sort of didn't quite sit accurately with me. Surely saying you killed all your own men is far more dishonourable from a Klingon's perspective than saying we were overwhelmed by Federation forces and had to pull back. In the end, obviously, Mbenga and Ra have this big shout out in the sickbay, and Mbenga pulls the knife he's hung on to for years and stabs him, and he claims kind of self-defense, but, was it really self-defense or was it retribution? There's obviously that, there's that grey area there because it all kind of happens behind the frosted glass of the sickbay window. So you're not quite sure as to whether, Ra started it or whether Mbenga started it or whether it was an issue of self-defense or whether it was an issue of murder. It's all kind of left a bit cloudy. And the episode finishes off with the faulty biobed, which I guess is a metaphor for Mbenga because he's kind of faulty. He's damaged, he's broken, he's trying to fix his ways, but he's still kind of damaged. So I guess the faulty biobed at the end was kind of like a metaphor for Mbenga's state of mind. There's some interesting stuff in this episode, but I also think there was a few inconsistencies and a few elements of plot logic and everything that were a little bit askew in this episode. So as a result, I didn't hate this episode. I think it was okay. I didn't love this episode. It was fine. Probably not one of my favourite episodes this season. I think there's probably a lot of other episodes I'd put before this one in terms of ranking. So I think I'd probably put this episode, fairly lower down my list of favourite episodes for the season 2, because I think we're going to be up for a bit of a treat with next week's musical episode. Hopefully, fingers crossed. I do think a large percentage of the cast in Strange New Worlds have a bit of a Broadway background, so that leads me with a bit of hope that it could very well be a very actually well done episode. And then obviously in episode 10, I'm pretty sure we've got a big Gorn finale. So I think there's a couple of really good episodes coming our way. I just wouldn't necessarily place episode 8 amongst my most favourite episodes for this season. But you guys might have thought otherwise and had a different opinion. Leave a thought in the comment section and let me know what your impressions were of episode 8, Under the Cloak of War. Guys, if you haven't subscribed to Sci-Finatics yet, please be sure to do so. Click on that big subscribe button to stay current and up to date with all the latest Star Trek news on YouTube. And check out my merch store, where you can pick up heaps of cool hoodies and mugs and t-shirts and stickers and yeah, all that cool paraphernalia, sci-fi and Star Trek themed. Plenty of cool choices there and designs to choose from, and it helps support the channel as well, so I much appreciate that. Guys, I'll be back very soon with the next video. I'll see you soon.